In a Ladies' Home Journal article of 1913 entitled, "If Men Were Seeking the Franchise," feminist Jane Addams, I'll give you a picture of her here, engaged in an interesting hypothetical enterprise. What, she asked, would have happened if American society had been matriarchal instead of patriarchal? Would men now be fighting for the right to vote? And if they were, in response to this demand for equal representation, what would women say? Addams presented an argument against male suffrage based on what she saw as a natural masculine opposition to feminine values. The hypothetical society she envisioned was, quote, organized upon the belief that there is no wealth but life. On the contrary, men had, from their youngest days, demonstrated tendencies towards vainglory and economic selfishness. Because they would not emphasize the nurture and education of children and the protection of the weak, sick, and aged, one might, in such a society, be suspicious of offering men suffrage. And yet, Addams continued, at least these objections were scrupled and based on some sense of historical fact. She could also envision an entirely different set of objections, ones that resorted not to questions of nature and proclivity, but instead insisted that men should not have the right to vote for interpersonal reasons. Why not? First of all, everyone knew that men would simply vote as their wives and mothers told them to. Secondly, if they did go out to the polls, it would surely result in a loss of respect from their wives, who had placed their husbands on a pedestal that required their abstention from the messiness of political life. Addams quickly noted that no woman, quote, would present these objections to men as real reasons for withholding the franchise from them, unless indeed they had long formed the habit of regarding men not as comrades and fellow citizens, but as a class by themselves, in essential matters really inferior, although always held very sentimentally high above them. While this argument for natural tendencies in opposition to political participation might be unfair, she noted, it was hardly as offensive as the dismissive attitude with which Addams herself was all too familiar. Rather than worrying about women's actual characteristics, or even their supposed ones, often men and women alike instead argued that women should openly reject any efforts to grant them suffrage in order to protect their uniqueness, to remain in a sentimental class apart. Addams' essay makes 2 points that I'd like to pull apart, because I think they are very useful for deepening our vision of feminism's range of concerns. The first, which admits to a number of general assumptions about women's uniquely nurturing role, embraces the conviction that one of women's strengths is valuing people over things. As part of her insistence that a matriarchal society might question men's judgment, she said, quote, every time a gun is fired in a battleship, it extends, or rather explodes, $1,700, as much as a college education costs many a country boy. And yet, you would be firing off these guns as mere salutes, with no enemy within 3,000 miles, simply because you so enjoy the sound of shooting. Where women would have a wealth of life, men would have, she believed, warfare, economic competition, and death. Addams claimed moral authority for women, and clearly believed that female solidarity would lead to a different kind of society than the one that had been created with the elevation of masculine power alone. In her language, it was not merely that women begat the next generation, though certainly that was one of the arguments for female suffrage, but instead it was that their nurturing was an essential component of society. So you can see here, for example, in one of the covers of a suffrage magazine, you see the woman represented as an angel with a child on her back, drawing in, I think you can probably see behind it, all of the interests of women and children and bringing them along with her. So female suffrage would allow activist women to be the angels that society needed. And yet, even as Addams enunciated a language of difference, she indicted the argument that this difference should be the basis for any type of esteem that limited women to the home. As Addams made clear in her other work, She believed that women had to negotiate both social and family obligations, and that too often both men and women persuaded women to privilege private lives and to give up public roles. Not much more than a year after Adams published her essay, remember the Ladies' Home Journal, 1913, we see a Ladies' Home Journal from 1914 where this is the cover, offering this kind of vision of women's natural role. The woman on this cover is content to serve as his inspiration, to earn and illustrate sentimental esteem, but not to be active in the construction of her own destiny. If you notice, she is holding a child. She has a dress that she basically can't walk in. It's of the same length, more or less, as the child's dress. She has what's probably house slippers. This is not a woman who's active or who's public. She's content to be painted and to be inspirational, but not to be active in her own destiny. Instead of being liberated for the greater good, Adams believed that images like this taught women to see their desire for public life as selfish and even capricious. Many chose, under great pressure, to remain in the home, making the lives of their husbands easier, but at great cost to society, which needed what she called their civic housekeeping. Women were politically excluded, and when that didn't work, emotionally manipulated into giving up their ambitions and ideas of engagement with the wider world. Instead, for the sake of this kind of sentimental esteem, for attachment to their husbands and children alone, they abandoned reaching for accomplishment in their own right. Anti-suffrage propaganda fit into this same last category, using disapproval and emotional manipulation to discourage female suffrage. Their images of suffragettes depicted politically active women abandoning their true roles and choosing to live outside social norms. So the first image, the woman, instead of wearing a skirt, she's wearing pants and she's being offered suspenders, right? So clearly, any braces today, lady, she's too masculine. And then the one next to it's even better, the really unattractive woman screaming outside for female suffrage. It's called The Shrieking Sister. At the bottom, you probably can't read it, but what the woman next to her is saying is, you help our cause while you're its worst enemy, right? So women's cause, anti-suffragists would have said, was not helped by public women. Suffragettes, they said, hurt women's real interests, were viragos, were fundamentally masculine. Real women were supposed to be at home, loving their children, not on street corners with their hair becoming indecently undone. Political women hurt women's causes, and worse yet, hurt society. Notice what happens in a suffragette's home. This is really one of my favorites. The husband arrives home after, quote, a hard day's work, that's what it says at the bottom, to be confronted with children in disarray. No food prepared, socks left undarned, shirts left unironed, the lamp is also left untrimmed. Like, it's terrible, terrible chaos. It's domestic chaos. The obvious message is that political women were not only hurting women's causes, but were also unable to negotiate family life and public life in any satisfactory way. Why would you want women in public life if their private lives were already so unmanageable? The other implication was, of course, that women on street corners were liable to excesses of all sorts. Public women in the worst sense, right? Street corner implies prostitution. So public women are also, by extension, prostitutes. How better to denigrate a woman's maternal role than to imply that she was no real mother at all, but a degraded and immoral woman of the streets. Even women who promoted suffrage did not seem certain how to negotiate between